African American Studies, and I think that she's going to bring a really great story today. She has told me that she grew up in Columbus, attended Spencer High, actually graduated from Spencer High. For those of you in the same room who may have also gone to Spencer as well, I see a couple of you are in the room. But she lived in a time when segregation was enforced by laws. In fact, when Columbus College was originally created, she could not attend here because of segregation. She has a great story. She has traveled to South Africa and has met Nelson Mandela. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what she will have to say about Mandela himself. She generously donated the exhibit that you see posted along the wall, so I do hope that before you leave, you'll have a chance to browse the exhibit. The exhibit that you see is about Nelson Mandela's life. However, she has a great wealth of resources of Mandela elsewhere as well. So I won't take up any more of her time, and I will allow Ms. Purnell to come and introduce herself, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, Columbus State University, let me say this. I am very, very honored to be here today. Let me make one correction before I start. I did not meet Nelson Mandela. When I was in South Africa, we were supposed to, my group, was supposed to have gone to Parliament in Cape Town, and we didn't get a chance to go there, okay? But I did get a chance to go to his house where he was arrested in Soweto. So with being in South Africa, during the time of repatriation, those of you that are in here, you do know what apartheid was. Do you all know what apartheid is? Yeah. Okay. Racial segregation in the South, you're familiar with. Yes. So let me sort of get started, because there are so many similarities between what occurred in South Africa as well as what occurred here in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. Many of the laws, when apartheid came about, we're talking about 20th century type of segregation that was imposed on a group of people that had known some freedoms. There was always racial differences in Africa, because you have black Africans, colors, as well as the Afrikaans, those that actually colonized Africa, Europeans that colonized Africa. And during the scramble for Africa, at the Berlin Conference, European nations met and decided what portions of Africa they would actually control. And all of it was in reference to natural resources. So hopefully, as I go along, if you have any questions, you can stop me at any time and just ask questions. Nelson Mandela's plight in South Africa, he actually volunteered. He organized the youth group for the African National Congress. And that grew out of another organization that was supposed to have been just for tribal organizations. But because racism in South Africa was so extreme, with apartheid, they also had what was in place, was called a pass system. You had to have a pass. And all of this was always a combination of race identification. You had to be registered, whether you were black, African, colored, or Afrikaan. Many, many laws. If there were any violations, you were arrested. So Mandela was not the first person to be arrested. Many of his fellow countrymen were arrested because they wanted freedom. They wanted equality. The same thing was happening in this country. Apartheid started in 1948. The civil rights movement in America, we think about modern day civil rights starting in the latter part of the 1950s, the early part of the 1950s, because we always think about the Montgomery bus boycott, which Martin Luther King was drawn into. And as you all know, he did not volunteer for that. There was a meeting held, and since he was a newcomer to Montgomery, those that met, who were members of the NAACP, decided to select Martin Luther King as their spokesperson. He was sort of forced into a situation of need. This country was in need of change. those of us that grew up in America under Plessy versus Ferguson, and you all know that that means separate but equal. It enforced the laws after slavery that separated black people from white people. They said that it was separate, but those of us who lived under it know that it was never equal. The school systems were never equal. The education that I received here in Columbus was by far probably one of the worst that anyone could compare it to any other in the country. And I'm saying it was just that bad because we never got new school books. And then there were race laws in reference to relationships between blacks and whites. You could not marry a person outside of your race. It was against the law. You could not live in certain neighborhoods. You could not even have certain jobs. In South Africa, the same thing was being imposed. Nelson Mandela, though, was trained, raised to be chief. So he was already trained in a warrior kind of clan. And I'm going to say it like that because to be a leader, you're trained, raised that way. Martin Luther King was not raised to be a leader. He was forced to be. He was a Morehouse grad. Nelson Mandela also a college grad. But different locations, different geographical locations, but the same race relations existed. Now many people would say, why could the same thing be happening in South Africa or in Africa to a black person that could happen in America, especially with the laws here in America? We would think that the Constitution would have protected African Americans or those who had been freed from slavery, but it didn't. We moved from slavery, Reconstruction, then the black codes, and then in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. You cannot interact with one another. Now, in American history, we know that there were 5 states during the time of slavery that freed all the slaves. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Those blacks that had lived in those areas of the country, even when they came south with the racial laws that they had in the south, if you were on the train riding south, once you got across the Mason-Dixon line, that front seat that you had, where you had equal representation, you had to move to the back of the train. You could not come into the south that way. So it was a whole different world. We lived in this country as a nation within a nation. Those that were in South Africa were definitely a nation within a nation. They were in the majority and still controlled. Because when Europeans came, they brought technology. And when I say that, they brought what? The gun. Rapid fire. So the warring class that had existed in reference to what Africans were accustomed to, they now had to deal with something new. So the takeovers took place. Mandela's involvement, as I said, was voluntary. He went to law school. He and his friend organized that youth organization for the ANC. They were anti-race segregation. They were anti-race domination. And one of the things that Mandela said that he would eradicate or work against the unequalness that had existed in the world, the oppression. The same thing with Dr. King. And in many of King's speeches, he stated that. As a matter of fact, Mandela quoted King from the March on Washington speech, when King said, "Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last." In this country, people are delusional when they think about freedom. Because a lot of you don't even know what racism is. You never had to deal with it. You have been integrated all of your life. For those of us who had to be victims will tell you that what happened in South Africa, Sharpeville was televised in 1960, and 69 people protesting the past system were shot down. Well, many people in this country were killed, and no one has ever been prosecuted for the deaths of these black people. So we could say that Sharpeville existed in America all the time. You never knew who would be next. From Medgar Evers to the freedom fighters or freedom riders of the 60s, those that came up missing. And they weren't all black people. So those of us who understand race and race oppression, what we see, and I'm going to say my vision, my dream, is that there's a possibility of race unification. I don't think that Dr. King nor Mandela were isolated in their views. We cannot survive in this world unless we unify. We've got to come together. You can pull apart if you like, But the resistance is going to cause you to go into ruination, because there's no way that you can live as an island. We've got to come up with a plan of action whereby we can teach good race relations and race understandings so that people will not be afraid to interact. Now, looking across this room, see, you got blacks and whites sitting at a table, at different tables together. If you went to a high school cafeteria, many times you'll find just the opposite. Am I right? Blacks all sitting at one table, whites at another table. But when we come into the university setting, and different teachings and understandings, different relationships form. Guess what they form? They're formed around education. Some of my best study buddies when I was in grad school happened to be what? Caucasians. And I went from a segregated environment to integrated. Now let me tell you how bad it was here in Columbus. Now, if you could think about Mandela and what happened in another country, we know how bad it was. You can YouTube. But one of the things you cannot YouTube is Columbus, Georgia, and race relations. No one is going to tell you that the high schools were so seriously segregated that even the teachers that taught at the Negro schools were not allowed to go in the front door of the administration building at the Board of Education. They did not sit in meetings. They did not make school board decisions in reference to what books would be used. We only got the books that was sent from white schools after they had used them and most likely weren't any good anymore. Those of you that read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor, you remember when a little man went into the book and he saw where they had covered up the dates for use? And they said that the last use, because they were in the poorest condition, they sent them to the what? To the nigga. That's what they had that's what she wrote it. Schools. We were victims. But when people say victims, they always want to realize, how do people survive under those circumstances? There was no public library here for us to have as a reference room until 1954 for Negroes, even though the public library did exist. If you went in, you would be arrested. The first high school was constructed in 1932 for African Americans. So look how long the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed prior to high school education being afforded to those of African descent in the city of Columbus. So what they did, they separated us with education and economics. If you wanted to go to high school, your parents had to send you away. So it was just like being in a third world country. You get to the 7th grade, your parents had to have money to send you either to Atlanta University that had a high school, or to Tuskegee Institute that had a high school. But without economics, you could not travel. The same thing was happening in Africa. Colonization encroached upon the lands, took the natural resources, converted them into other things. Africans were what? Nomadic by nature. They moved around. They were not accustomed to borders. When I was in Africa, one of the strangest things was get to a border, going into another country, and seeing Africans attempting to travel, they'll migrate, they'll move, they're going to see relatives. And they get to the border, they have to have a passport. Passports cost money. How do you move? There is no regulated pay scales for workers in South Africa. You make what you can make. When I was there, the exchange was 20 to 1. $1 US for 20 African dollars. And there was no inflation. Poverty was everywhere. And they were just coming out from under apartheid. Now, with the way I look, I ended up going into a bank, and a colored clerk in the bank called bank security on me. She said I was too dark complexioned to be in the bank. So security escorted me into a room, and I had to take my gele off. And I'm telling them I'm Black American and not Black African. Rules. No bank. You did too dark to be in the bank. on the streets. I was glad I had a Caucasian roommate while I was traveling, because what I couldn't get by purchase from an African, she could. We needed water. I went into a store to buy the water. I was told by the store owner that he could not sell to me. I sent Cindy in. She comes out with 2 bottles of water. So then we realized on the streets of Africa, South Africa, that if she wanted to purchase from black Africans, she needed to have me purchase it. If we needed something out of a store from a merchant that was an African, she had to do it. Racism. You can legislate laws, but you cannot legislate mentalities. People are who they are until they are taught different. Then based on interactions, it will cause people to come closer because of the knowledge. But let me say this. South Africa was not the only place that I've been racially, I thought, a stereotype. I was in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and they thought I was a black Dominican, and that I had was part of some thieves, people who had been stealing from the hotel. And would you believe that security actually made me identify myself? Of course, I sued the tour company, but still, being black can have some really serious political, social, and legal drawbacks. So I have learned to be the best that I can be as far as knowledge and the acquisition of. I know that racism exists, not only here in Columbus, all over the world. We're trying to change that. I'm hoping that education will do that. And I'm sure that as Mandela, who even though was in South Africa, Martin Luther King, who was in the southern part of this country, we all had that dream of one day that what's happening right now in this room would take place. King said he would wish for the day that people would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Mandela, even though he was incarcerated 27 years, did in fact look forward to embracing all South Africans as one because of the country. You can't have infighting and be successful. And that's just the way of the world, folks. I know that some of you have not lived in segregated environments, your parents have not, because after generations pass, then people sort of forget. But there are some of those folks who have not forgotten. Because anytime you start talking about reviewing the Voting Rights Act, not all of it, but just the federal controls that went in, we might have problems again. Because they're going to have reviews. Because all of those folks who at one time, who did not believe that blacks were human, that they had the inability to learn, are still around. And many of those actually make major decisions in this country. So we've got to really deal with those folks. And you all can make a difference. We said it in the 60s, going to say it again in the 70s, said it in the 80s and 90s, we're still saying it. Jesse Jackson said, keep hope alive. Many people don't even know what that means. We are hoping for a better day. I believe that I am the hope and the dream of the slave. You all are the hopes and dreams of other people. Some of you all are first-generation college people. Some of you all are going to go back to your hometowns and teach. But one of the things, never forget who you are. Never forget what America is. Never forget what the world has for you. The lives of people that have died so that change would take place. Who was Nelson Mandela? A man who had a major impact on a nation of people and subsequently to the world. He represents physical oppression around the world. He will always be remembered in the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. Martin Luther King, the same way. The only difference, one volunteered, the other one didn't. Mandela moved from nonviolence to the thoughts of violence because he thought that there would never be change in South Africa. Some of the reports that are coming out now says that he was a member of the Communist Party, that he had the support of other countries that the United States did not align themselves with. But that's okay. The struggle was so uniquely different. Anytime you can take someone's life without justice, anytime they cannot have liberties, nor the pursuit of happiness, as we are supposedly have guarantees in the Constitution, you take away everything from people. I can't even imagine you all in a situation where you could not move around freely. You wouldn't even know how to act. For someone to tell you they will not serve you because you're black, or you cannot live somewhere because you're black. So the 1964, the Civil Rights Acts, the Voting Rights Acts, 1964-65, the second great emancipation in this country for African Americans. And we're still fighting for more to be emancipated. In South Africa, the Reconciliation Act, was it 1998? When the police and everyone was accused of using excessive force in South Africa, in the murders that were committed in reference to the resistance. And whenever there's oppression, people, you will always have resistance. Always. When I heard people referring to Nelson Mandela as Madiba, I thought that was a term of endearment. But it represents what? His clan. He's Hosha. And they are one of the major groups in South Africa. There was no way that a small group of individuals could have kept South Africa in bondage any longer after Sharpeville. Television, the media, exposure. The same thing with the Montgomery bus boycott. After that, you started seeing news clips. Birmingham, Bull Connor, dogs, hoses, student revolts, Kent State, UC Berkeley, Jackson State, and let me not forget Tuskegee, because I was there in '68 when the tanks rolled on campus. The university was closed. National news, resistance, protests, mainly because Tuskegee was about to lose all of its accreditations. All of the sciences would have gone to Auburn University. Auburn University students had to graduate from Tuskegee in the School of Veterinary Medicine because Auburn didn't offer a degree in it. So Caucasians did not want to get a degree from a black school, a HBCU, during the 60s. So they wanted to bring Tuskegee under the chancellorship of Auburn University. We didn't want that. George Wallace, his wife Lurleen, governors of Alabama, cut off state funds to the university. They were going to shut us down. So the students decided we're not going to go for that. So the next thing we knew, when the trustees came to campus and we locked them up, they said that we had them kidnapped. We really didn't. But changed. And this was all part of the process. And one last thing, and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to let you all ask the questions. Students during the 60s and 70s had to sign a form with the Department of Justice indicating that we would not participate in any acts that were subversive. If you were ever defined as being a member of a subversive group, one that was conspiring to overthrow the government, then you would be permanently, you would not be allowed to receive any federal funds for your education. And that was following the McCarran Act. How many of y'all are familiar with McCarran? All right. Okay, let me ask you something. Can you all ask me some questions? I'll make some statements. Yes, sir.
Why do you feel that Martin Luther King was forced to be a leader?
Oh, let me say this. And you're going to love this because the person that actually appointed him to be the spokesperson for the Montgomery bus boycott is Attorney Fred Gray. He lives in Tuskegee, Alabama right now. He practices law. He has written a book on the Montgomery bus boycott entitled Bus Ride to Justice. Dr. King had just gotten to Montgomery when they were organizing the bus boycotts. The NAACP had been talking about it. Rosa Parks was not the first person to be arrested. Claudette Colvin was not the first person. They can go all the way back to the 40s. Rosa Parks happened to fit a certain image. And what happened was that photo was just disseminated all over the world. And she represents that kind of freedom movement. But if you all, in some of your classes, please write this down. Contact Fred Gray. He's on the internet. You can order his book. He does lectures. Fred Gray is responsible for integrating every public facility in the state of Alabama. Did Martin Luther King volunteer? No. He was a young man. He had just gotten to Dexter Street Baptist Church down in Montgomery. They said that he was young in the city. No one knew him. See, they knew, all the whites knew all the other people, E.B. Nixon and those that organized the movement. They didn't know King. And one of his members of his church said that he was a good, very good orator, and he'd make a good spokesman. So he was volunteering. We are glad that he accepted it.
You said he was selected.
Yes, sir. Because he wasn't at the meeting.
I'm just saying, from what the statement, how you made it seem as if they said, you're going to be the leader. And
Oh.
right. Okay.
Actually, he did. He wasn't at the meeting. Rosa Parks was there, Fred Gray. And they said Martin Luther King would be the spokesperson. And he accepted. Now, I don't know what would have happened if he had been there. You know what? Sometimes we think twice about things if we're in the meeting. And I'm going to say that because I was recently volunteered for something. And I turned it down because I'm one of those people that are very opinionated. Actually, I'm going a little slower here today because I don't know who you all that live. You know. But the mayor of the city asked me to participate on this, The Dream Still Lives. One of the reasons that I hesitated is because Martin Luther King came to Columbus in 1956. The Prince Hall Masons invited